So, as always, we are learning for the Menucha of Sir Moshe Montefiore and Sir Naim Dangur. We are in the last unit, the final one that has to do with Kavod, ועונג, Shabbat. That's the last one is going to be before we start Shemitah, Bezrat Hashem, after Shavuot. That's the plan. According to Beit Shammai, the Isur of plowing your field before pre-Shemitah begins after Shavuot. I guess it's timely to start understanding what Shemitah is about. We're not going to be doing that yet. At the moment, someone here is too much noise. First, we have to finish this issue of Kavod, ועונג, Shabbat. So we learned about what one should and shouldn't read. What one should and shouldn't think about, should and shouldn't discuss, should or shouldn't deal with, right? Tend to. And now we're going to learn about what is appropriate to read on Shabbat. And we're going to ask as well, is this prohibition of reading this specific reading material and finding the appropriate reading material for Shabbat the same kind of Isur? Does it really stem from the same source, from the same Isur? So this starts from two Mishnayot that notably do both not mention the Isur of reading Shiur Yotot, which is presumably the original Gzeira. Right? How do you translate Shiur Yotot? Let's read a bit before I ask you how we translate Shiur Yotot. A few thoughts about how to translate Shiur Yotot. We'll get to that soon. So the Mishnah at the beginning of Perek Zayin Masechet Shabbat says, Kol Kitvei HaKodesh Matzilin otan mipnei hadlika. This whole parak talks about there's a fire. What do you do on Shabbos? So what muktzah are you allowed and aren't allowed? What are you allowed to carry and aren't allowed, etc. So they say you're allowed to schlep around Kitvei HaKodesh, and this is the interesting sentence. Ben shekorin behen uven she'en korin behen. Now, presumably, we're not talking about Kitvei HaKodesh that no one reads, because if no one reads them, why do you have them? So we're talking about Kitvei HaKodesh that are not read. Not so clear why not. So the Mishnah ends up, I skipped a bit here, certain things you're not allowed to read, despite, interesting thing. We're talking about Kitvei HaKodesh. You're not allowed to read because that'll be wasting the Beit Midrash's time, because you should be in the Beit Midrash. Instead, you have Kitvei HaKodesh that you're reading. You have to understand what this means. So the Gemara explains over here. I'm dafta kufta zayin with bet amarav lo shanua lebezman Beit Midrash, אבל שלא בזמן Beit Midrash korin. So Rashi above explains what would happen is like this. When would people have time to come hear Shiur? On Wednesday evening. Yeah. In their time, when people have time to come, people wouldn't go out after dark. Well, it wasn't a thing until modern times. When do people have time to go out and hear a Shiur? On Shabbos afternoon. So during the Shabbos afternoon time, when everyone should be going and hearing Shiur, you shouldn't be reading these other things. So Rav says, at the time when the Beit Midrash is active, that's when you're not allowed to read these, Kitvei HaKodesh. But any other time during Shabbat, you are allowed, Leil Shabbat, after the Seudah. In their days, they didn't really have enough light, but let's say they try. And then you'd read that, then you wouldn't be allowed to read these Kitvei HaKodesh. Now, what are Kitvei HaKodesh? Just so you see. Ben Shein Korim Behem, I'm just marking in Rashi earlier, Gon Ketuvim. So are you allowed to read Sefer Ezra, Nehemiah on Shabbat? So Rav says you're allowed to read it as long as you're not missing Shiur in the Beit Midrash. Shmuel says, Afil shelo b'zman Beit Midrash ein korin. It's one thing to say you shouldn't be reading all these other Sfarim now. It's not a good time to read Sefer Iyov right now on Shabbos afternoon. Mishlei, you should find other times to read. You should be in the Beit Midrash hearing Shiur, the more serious Shiur. The rest of the Shabbat, you could spend reading all of those. We'll get. Oh, that's also true. We're going to get to newspapers later on, but yeah, that's a fair point. And Shmuel says no. On Shabbos, you do not read Ketuvim at all. Rav Ashi Amar, L'olam kedei Maran meikara. The bottom line of the Gemara is that Shmuel is correct, but he's correct for the wrong reason, as it were. Shmuel is citing a very specific Tana, Rabbi Nechemia, who was opposed to reading Sefer Nechemia. Just pointing out, Tanya, Afal Pi Shamu Kitvei Kodesh Ein Korin Behem, Val Shonim V'Dorshim Behem, Nitzach HaPasuk Mevi V'Ro'eh Bo. So Nakama here says, you're not supposed to sit and learn Sefer Nechemia or Divrei Yamim on Shabbos, but if you need, you could take it and Rabbi Nechemia, this Tana is also Rabbi Nechemia. Rabbi Nechemia, this is the Gemara goes on and explains that the whole bright is only Rabbi Nechemia. Why are you not allowed to read Ktuvim? It's part of the Tanakh. It's in fact it's the of the Tanakh, right? Why are you not allowed to read that on Shabbat? Kedei sheyomru b'kitvei kodesh ein korim kol sheken b'shitro hadyotot. That's how far Rabbi Nechemia is going to go with this. He says, I want you to appreciate the Gzeira, because what's the problem? The problem is you're going to think if you're allowed to read Sefer Megillat Esther, you're also allowed to read your legal papers, your and the other business related papers you have. An interesting point about this comparison, I mean, the rest of the Tanaim disagree, right? The only Rabbi Nechemia thinks that only Rabbi Nechemia says that you're not allowed to read anything that isn't the utmost highest level of learning on Shabbat, so people can understand you can only learn high level learning on Shabbat. You could read Morenu on Shabbat, but anything less than Morenu, forget it, right? The rest of the Tanaim say you are allowed to read the other things, but what's interesting is what Rabbi Nechemia is reasoning, right? He says, if people see you, someone who's a serious Jew, should be learning Morenu, and instead he's wasting his time learning Sefer Ezra Nechemia, he'll go and read a newspaper, or he'll go and read his legal documents or his business documents or whatever, right? So for that reason, we're not going to read those. I'm just going to point out the Mishnah Berurah says this. Anyone know where the Mishnah Berurah cites this reasoning? Chazarat HaShatz. He says, also Talmid Chacham isn't allowed to learn Torah during Chazarat HaShatz. Nowadays, this is more relevant than ever. Why? Because if I'm waiting for the Chazan to start Chazarat HaShatz, what do? I take out my phone and go over the parsha. The guy next to me takes out his phone and opens the news. And the guy next to him opens the sports, right? That's what happens, right? So this idea of Rabbi Nechemia, it's an astonishing thing. How much time do we spend Chazarat HaShatz? You should be listening to the Chazan anyway. You shouldn't really be learning anyway during Chazarat HaShatz. Fine. But the whole Shabbos, Rabbi Nechemia says, do not learn anything of Ketuvim the whole Shabbos, just so no one else will read Harry Potter. Well, he didn't say Harry Potter. He said Shiur Hadyotot. I don't know if Harry Potter is included. We'll get to that. Shiur Hadyotot, presumably at this point means business, legal papers or business papers or some documents, I'd say, what should we call it? Let's call it business-related documents. It's fair? Okay. We'll go deeper into the definition later on. So that's one source to the idea. Now, I'll just point out, the Mishnah itself did not mention Shiur Hadyotot. The Gemara mentions that we answered this Kal V'chomer from Shiur, not Kal V'chomer, sorry. So people will make the Kal V'chomer from Shiur Hadyotot, from Tanakh to Shiur Hadyotot. Right? Just pointing that out. Next Mishnah, bottom of the first page over here. When you have a list of guests or you have a list of dishes that you want to serve on Shabbat, so you're not allowed to read it out of a page. You can't have a piece of paper from which you're going to mark off the different, to make sure all the guests are here, make sure everyone's seated, make sure that you served all the dishes. You're not allowed to do that on Shabbat. Says the Gemara, why not? My Tama. Top of the second page. So Rabbi Bivai says, we're concerned if you're going to go over a list, you're going to start marking off, right? You're going to erase. Now, by the way, we're talking about erasing or writing, right? Why? So based on this, well, we'll get to that later on, but based on this, if you have... Right, you could write it out, sure. Right. So it's one of those ironies where if you're serving many things, so you need, right, if you're You really do need that. If you're not serving so much, kitzer. We end up so we end up forgetting to serve things on Shabbat for this reason. But the concern, so Rabbi Vai is concerned you're going to start marking them off, which is kind of the point, right? What I meant to say is, if you have a very long list, it isn't as helpful if you can't mark them off, right? If it's a short list, you don't need the list so badly. If you have a long list, right? I think many of us, I know I do. I swear by this, by the to-do lists on my phone. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. We have a grocery list, and then whenever, we have to remember, I have to write it down. Then at the store, I can just mark them off as I go along. You're not allowed to do that on Shabbat because you'll mark them off. That's what Rabbi Vai says. Abai says, no, which is astonishing, right? Here we're talking about the guest list. We're talking about the list of food. This is a mitzvah, right? We're doing Sudat Shabbat. We're serving many people. We want to make sure the food is good. We want to make sure we served everything. And yet here, the Gzera Shema Ikra Shitera Yotot. That's how far it goes. Here too, by the way, the Mishnah and the Gemara do not mention what? The more basic Gzera, which is the Isur of reading Shitera Yotot. That's not mentioned anywhere. It doesn't mention anywhere. These are the two sources. Rabbi Nechemiah's Kal V'chomer, that we want people to write. We want people to
reading something that would distract you from reading something else, reading something that's not going to distract you.
Okay, so we're going to have to define this more. We're going to have to refine the definitions, of course. But I just want to point a few things out. The first thing is, here, let's read the next part in the Gemara. This is an interesting thing. You have an artist, the artistic description, right? You have a piece of art, right? You have an artwork, and you have the description. Is there a name, the label? I don't know what it's called. You know what I'm talking about? The title, right? Then you have a museum, you have a title, you have a label, whatever it is. You're not allowed to read that on Shabbat. Once again, Rashi explains this similarly, because this continues the same Gemara, right? Rashi explained this. So all these things are all the Gzera Shema. It's an interesting thing. The Gemara itself does not mention that there's a Gzera, that there's an Isur to read Shitera Yotot. All three cases are all Gzera Shema Shitera Yotot. So the first case is also not accepted lahalacha, but there it's Rabbi Nechemiah who goes all out, right? And says you can't read anything lest someone else will read Shitera Yotot. Anything, even Tanakh you can't read, right?
Leaving aside that very strong exclusion,
right?
Many times you'll see on Shabbat people will have a list, and in order to make sure they know who's arrived or
right,
whatever, they use like little dots that they, stickers that they put on. They're not writing, they're not permanent, but they put it like a sticker there to say, okay, and that's the way that they mark things.
On a list.
On a list.
Like
on the list. Or a paper clip, John's proposing here, right?
Right.
It's a fair point. We're going to have to look at this issue of lists later on, right? And can you circumvent the list issue by saying, well, I'm going to do things because we have to pay attention. Rav Bivai says Gzera Shema Imchak, and then you say, well, maybe you can use lists because you might erase them. And then if I have some kind of solution, for example, we'll see later on, if two people read it together and it's for a mitzvah, then there's room for leniency. Fine. But Abai says categorically you can't read them. Regardless of what the method is going to be, categorically you can't read them because Shemek Rashi Tedyatot, l'chora is more machmir. Right? That's a bit of a, and again, it's quite surprising considering that, right, how far out we're going here. It's saying you can't read the lists because you might read business documents. Now, you could argue that there's more relationship between the business documents, right, business-related documents, and lists of food guests where you're running your meal. You could somehow see the comparison. But these other two is very hard. First of all, Tanakh is like, what? And the second, when you talk about the labels on the artworks, that's also very surprising. Right?
little odd.
Please repeat the question.
Oh yeah, I was going to. Don't worry. If you go, I don't know. Is there an issue of going to an art gallery on Shabbat?
Looking at this entire issue of
Oh, beseder. So again, if you go to the Nechemia route, so the question was about Bichlal, going to museums, going to art galleries on Shabbat. I don't know. In other words, once again, do we really end up utilizing the Shabbos time quite as effectively and efficiently anyway? But it's a good question. It's a good question in that sense. But theoretically, right? Someone moves in and has an interesting art collection, and he says, "Hey, why don't you come over? You have some time on Shabbos, see my art collection." They're allowed to read the labels. It's an interesting question, but what I just wanted to point out is the Gemara, just in terms of the sources, the Gemara doesn't mention anywhere that you're not allowed to read Shiur. It doesn't say that anywhere in the Shas. All it says is you're not allowed to do all these other things, because it's similar to reading Shiur, right? Because it'll lead to reading Shiur, which is interesting. And also we see how far out we go, and this does raise an important question. For example, going to an art gallery at all, if you can't read those things, should you be looking at art to begin with? The Gemara seems to assume that you are looking at an art gallery, right? Just not reading the descriptions, not reading the labels. It is an interesting point. We're going to have to go deeper in and see. And so let's move into the thing themselves. Let's see first of all, why is this asur, and then the definitions and the parameters.